couple of weeks, so you're either very fortunate or something else, I guess, to hear it now. It's set not very far from here, about 45 minutes away in Hampshire on an area of heathland, and I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning. Sometimes dying, like much of life, happens quietly. Several weeks before I learned of my Aunt Aberlane's fatal collapse, she sent me a long email preoccupied with death, and especially with what she described more than once as its common insignificance. Dying was such an unexceptional event, she went to great effort to explain, that irrespective of the circumstances, strictly speaking, it was to be regarded as a trifle, and not only for the one who died. The proper measure for how well a life had been lived, she insisted, was how inconsequential one's death turned out to be. None of this struck me as particularly out of the ordinary at the time. I was well accustomed to receiving such emails, expansive and without preliminaries, about death, silence, privacy and solitude, or what I suppose might be described more broadly as absenteeism. Sometimes they were about each of these things combined, other times one subject predominated, often set down in a knotty and meandering arc, but the general tenor was always the same. Even in retirement, the mainstays of her lectures and seminars remained her most frequent companions. Throughout her life, at least as I'd come to know it, she'd always been drawn to characters who disappeared in one way or another. Freedom, or independence, I think, was her real subject. Commonly, she wrote about art and photography, and almost always about literature. Most often she returned to Henry David Thoreau's Cabin in the Woods, Emily Dickinson's Reclusion, or else that white, luminous, implacable glare at the end of Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, into which the narrator irrevocably disappears. My aunt's real fondness, though, was for Bartleby, a figure who, in his constant refusal to participate, paradoxically exemplified for my aunt what it meant to live a committed life. The correct response to almost all demands on our time, Robert, she told me repeatedly, is, I would prefer not to. Whenever I mentioned that Bartleby's declension at the end of the narrative, Even to Eat, was the cause of his pitiful and entirely preventable death, my aunt brushed my objections aside, informing me instead that my willful inability to grasp the point of the story was emblematic of my own misaligned priorities and ample evidence of my need to read both more carefully and more thoughtfully. I happened to be in Aldi when I opened my aunt's last email, scrolling her sentences with one hand while I pushed the increasingly heavy and cumbersome trolley up one aisle and down another. I continued to read while I unloaded and packed at the checkout, before transferring various bags of differing sizes and materials into the boot of our family car. It was only as I returned the trolley and retrieved my pound coin, all the while continuing to read my aunt's interminable email, my phone clutched precariously in my right hand, that I remembered I'd forgotten to buy stuffed pasta, the request for which Claire had specifically reminded me about when I closed the front door. I shut the boot and sank into the comfort of the driver's seat, preferring to grumble to Claire about empty shelves, the curious absence of fresh pasta, supply chain issues and Brexit, then re-enter the supermarket and queue all over again in the long lines at the checkouts for 2 plastic packaged items I had no wish to consume in the first place. Drizzle fell on the windscreen. In the latter part of the email, after a protracted description of the convulsions and rapid putrefaction of Rogers's distended body following his suspected poisoning at the hands of the first mate and Pym, my aunt wrote about Stieglitz's photographs of clouds, discussing at length how the absence of any horizon in the images made it difficult to discern which way was up and which was down. It was an effect, she went on to say, that Stieglitz himself had tried to exaggerate by frequently exhibiting the photographs inverted or on their sides. What particularly interested her, though, was the fact that no matter how long she looked at the prints in catalogues, monographs, or on her computer, and no matter the depth of absorption she felt at the various scenes of mackerel grey mists and skies, she found it completely impossible to keep a mental hold of any single image. Each photograph for her simply merged into a loose and largely fleeting impression of transience and vertigo. There was no explanation why her attention suddenly shifted, if indeed it had, to these photographs, although nor did I really expect to be offered one. Prolonged exposure to such correspondence had me well primed to know that I was expected to put the pieces of her disparate thinking together, to connect one opaque thing with another, and from there to draw my own conclusions. Inferences that to her, no doubt, were patently obvious, but which she also knew I would most likely misunderstand, or later misrepresent. There was never any shortage of opportunity to fail her in some way. I never did reply to my aunt, at least not directly. It wasn't uncommon negligence. The day I received the email, I imagine, simply drifted on into the restocking of kitchen cupboards and the suggestion of a takeaway in the absence of stuffed pasta. And when night fell, or a brief moment of calm at any rate after Thomas and Connie were finally in bed, the arrival of the email, together with the polite necessity of replying, never even entered my mind, and didn't in fact recur until some months after I received news that my aunt's already decomposing body had been stumbled upon by an assiduous postal worker determined to leave his parcel in a safe place. It was then, too late of course, in dull, lethargic moments at work, of which there were many, or in the small hours while Claire and the children slept, that I googled Stieglitz's photographs for myself, staring at their monochrome layers as if expecting to see a cloud in the shape of her face, but came across only her absence, those shifting and drifting skies obscuring more profoundly than anything else all that refused to come into view. And as I looked but didn't see, I thought about loose threads, how in certain conditions any division between clouds is impossible to discern. And I thought about how much I took for granted, how abruptly carelessness can become a habit, and from there to all the largely unacknowledged and unspoken reasons why, for much of her life and certainly the entirety of mine, my aunt and I had been so intricately bound one with the other. Perhaps death unties those bonds, releases them to a degree, although much later it occurred to me that its effect was the opposite, that death entangles, propelling us at the same time, both the living and the departed, backwards and side to side, into equivalence, into what happened or what may have happened. Either way, it doesn't make much difference, and the dead, like those left behind, are never free. It's only of the character of the silence that changes. Thank you.